Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Digital Hammurabi. I'm your host, Megan Lewis, and today I'm joined by a very special guest, Dr. Eckart Frahm of Yale University. Dr. Frahm received his PhD from the University of Göttingen in 1996, his Habilitation from Heidelberg University in 2007, and is a professor of Near Eastern languages and civilizations at Yale. Dr. Frahm has written and edited numerous academic works, including A Companion to Assyria and Ancient Mesopotamia Speaks, highlights of the Babylonian Yale collection. And he's also the founder and director of the Cuneiform Commentaries Project, an online database of Babylonian and Assyrian text commentaries. He's very kindly agreed to talk to us today about the Bible's ancient Near Eastern context. Dr. Frahm, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Megan, for having me.
Of course, it's my pleasure. So before we dive into today's topic of discussion, would you mind just briefly telling the audience how you got into the field of Seriology?
Yeah, I mean, it's not that this was my kindergarten plan, so to speak. I actually want to become a sportscaster on the radio, though not a screen, so no. But that didn't work out. And as it then happened, while in high school, I had the opportunity to take a course in biblical Hebrew, not because I was particularly religious, but really out of curiosity. That was a language that was really different from anything I'd learned until then. And through that course, I actually realized that there was this whole world of the ancient Near East, a world of 3,500 years of written documentation on all sorts of different things that altogether seemed not very much explored yet. And while I, of course, when I started on this, I had no real idea how it would be, I did sort of realize there was still a lot to be done. And my work was then initially not in any way on the Hebrew Bible, and I should say that right away. I approach the Bible here and in general when I write about it as what I would call an informed outsider. I have no, let's say, I have no formal university training, and therefore cannot speak with full authority, let's say, on the redaction layers of biblical text and such things. But I would still say that Assyriologists like me have something to say about the Hebrew Bible. I got interested in actually looking at the Hebrew Bible through the lenses of the ancient Near East, in fact, by chance. Some point early in the 2000s, I got an invitation to speak about the city of Ashur and the god Ashur in the Hebrew Bible. And as I later learned, I had received that invitation by mistake. It was actually meant for someone else. But I said, okay, I'll do it. And I realized, among other things, and I thought it was quite exciting in a way, that neither the city nor the god Ashur were ever mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. That in and of itself struck me as rather remarkable. And ever since I actually prepared that very lecture, I have, at least sort of on the sideline, written about it, worked about it on various aspects of the Hebrew Bible in its ancient Eastern setting.
Mm. And you teach an undergraduate, I believe, course at Yale on this topic. Is it a very popular course? Do you get a lot of students attending?
No, I wouldn't say really it's popular. And here, I mean, maybe that has to do with my teaching style, not being fully up to it. But I think it's also sort of kind of interesting that it isn't as popular as such a course, I think, would have been 100 years ago or 120 years ago. When this issue of the Hebrew Bible in its ancient Eastern setting was really sort of front news. So after the rediscovery of the ancient sites of Assyria and Babylonia, especially the famous library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh in the mid-19th century, it was soon realized that what came to the fore here was the world of ancient Mesopotamia speaking again on its own and in its own terms, and in a way talking back to the Bible up to then for thousands of years, ever since the last cuneiform tablet had been written. All that was known about Mesopotamia essentially came from the Bible itself and to some extent from classical historians. But there wasn't anything from Assyria or Babylonia. And now suddenly, within a few decades, tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of written documents and many other sources were suddenly available. And one could engage in a dialogue here between the biblical world and the Hebrew Bible on one hand, and the world of Mesopotamia and the text from Mesopotamia on the other. And that dialogue is sort of what is kind of interesting. And it is a dialogue full of tension, which was initially actually perceived with some anxiety, and I think is still perceived with some anxiety, leading sort of to political, not unrest, but drama, I would say. I mean, the British Prime Minister Gladstone attended a lecture given by George Smith on his discovery of the Flood tablet of the Gilgamesh epic, which presents a story of the flood that is very similar to the one found in the Bible, but different. And of course, that raised the question, well, is the biblical story derivative and therefore perhaps less authoritative? Also, later in Germany, the German Kaiser around 1900 very much so fell for this idea of pan-Babylonism, that everything important comes from Babylonia, which led to clashes with the Protestant establishment. So this was all very politicized. And then after World War I, there was a movement away from these approaches, often marked by a certain degree of parallelomania. So people were looking for parallels all over the place. Everything they found was just the same. And in the 1920s, a new paradigm essentially established itself, that you study ancient civilizations in their own right. So we shouldn't really look at Mesopotamia through biblical lenses and vice versa. And that was then indeed the approach for several decades. But in recent decades, maybe because we are now again living in a more global age, interest in ancient Mesopotamia as a source for, understanding the Bible has, I think, increased again, and scholars have worked on it again. And I think for good reasons. It is always interesting to compare. I think we learn a lot by comparison. This comparison, however, shouldn't just be equating and saying something is earlier than something else, or something is just modeled on something. What interests me particularly, when I do look for parallels, if you wish, but what I find most interesting when doing so is how are these models actually adapted? What's different who we find in the Bible? How does the Bible deal with the materials that it does find in ancient Mesopotamia and transform these materials? And how does it cope with the historical realities? And you have to imagine that the first texts produced that eventually made it into the collection that is the Hebrew Bible emerged in this political context of succeeding empires. First the Syrian Empire up to 612 BCE, then the Neo-Babylonian Empire until 539 BCE, when the Judeans were in exile in Babylon, of course, a traumatic and very important phase, and probably the one where contacts between, is the world of Israel and the world of Mesopotamia were closest, and then after that, the Achaemenid and then the Seleucid Empire. So these encounters with empire, I think, were also extremely important for the outlook that you find, the theological outlook that you find in the Bible, kind of transformation you can see of political ideology into theology, if you wish. I think that is something we can only understand, actually, when we really approach the Hebrew Bible from this comparative perspective. But you asked about the class, and I still feel like we are living now in a time where, on one hand, a lot of people sort of are religiously illiterate, know nothing really at all anymore about religion, and another part is essentially worried about any kind of impinging on religious belief and fundamentally approach sacred texts from a more or less fundamentalist perspective. And those people are worried about these kinds of questions. So within that kind of scenario, it's not so easy, I think, to approach this from a scholarly point of view. But I would also say, I mean, the Hebrew Bible is probably the most important book ever written, that ever came into being. And Clemenceau once said that war is too important to leave it to the generals, and I would say the Hebrew Bible is too important to leave it entirely to the religious. So that is also part of my own approach here.
I have to say that the lack of interest does surprise me, because some of the most popular material that we have, our most well-attended interviews, generally are those that deal with the Bible, especially the Bible in relation to Mesopotamia, and looking at how the biblical scholars, like you said, took Mesopotamian texts and tropes and themes and kind of reworked them for their own purposes. But I do think you make an excellent point of people being illiterate with regards to their own religious text, and also being quite uncomfortable when they find these parallel similarities, when they realize that the Bible actually is in conversation with a much wider literary tradition than we have preserved just in that one collection of texts in the Hebrew Bible. So could you talk a little bit about how Israel and Judah's kind of existence on maybe the periphery of these big Mesopotamian empires may have influenced or gave rise to some of the texts that we now have in the Hebrew Bible?
Yeah. So first of all, I think it's important to keep in mind that much of what the Bible really talks about is this very time of these empires that I mentioned. So there's a lot in 2 Kings about the Assyrians, about the Babylonians, and then in later books you find the Persians and so on. So this is really the environment where the earliest books of the Bible, or the earliest forms of those books, were composed. Anything about earlier history is probably to a significant extent legendary. So there is not a single king, ancient Near Eastern king or Egyptian king, mentioned from the 3rd or 2nd millennium in the Hebrew Bible, perhaps with the exception of Genesis 14, where Amraphel, maybe Hammurabi. I mentioned that because you're the digital Hammurabi. So that's still debated. But if that is the case, then they would have encountered Hammurabi through the later tradition. Hammurabi was a figure not only of history, but also of memory. He continued to play an important role throughout Mesopotamian literary history, so to speak. So I would say, as far as the Syrian Empire is concerned, it was probably mostly the political impact that empire had that shaped certain books of the Bible, and not so much perhaps at that point the cuneiform texts that were adapted by biblical authors, even though to some extent that may have happened as well. But this is the time sort of between the 8th century and the mid 7th century when both the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah really become into the orbit of Assyria. And Israel is eventually, the kingdom of Israel is eventually destroyed by Assyria and is divided up into provinces, including the province Samaria. The city of Samaria is conquered in 722 and 700 BCE. And that happened, the 720 conquest and the turning of Samaria into a province under the Assyrian king Sargon. And what I believe, and that's not my idea, it was an idea that scholars had early on, among other things, for example, is that there is a sort of mocking dirge about the death of the king of Babel in the book of Isaiah, Isaiah 14, which sort of pokes fun at a king, a Mesopotamian king who had tried to conquer the world, but then died on the battlefield without his body being buried. And that song, for example, I would say was most likely written in response to the death of the Assyrian king Sargon in 705, that very king who had actually conquered Samaria. And it's not surprising that biblical authors would have had an interest in depicting that king as someone who had a really bad end, because they were not too fond of this guy for obvious reasons. So they kind of described the end of that king in a somewhat triumphalist way. Sargon did actually die that very death. He did go on a campaign in 705 to the land of Tabal in Anatolia, and on that campaign, the Assyrian military camp was assaulted by the enemy, and as we know from Assyrian cuneiform texts, the body of the king was actually taken away, and it wasn't possible to bury the king, which was really bad because people were very afraid of ghosts of dead people who hadn't been properly buried haunting the living. And with a powerful man like Sargon, the most powerful man of his time, of course, that fear must have been particularly intense. So you have a discourse on that death, even in Assyria itself. And I've pointed out myself that in 705, just about a week before the accession of Sargon's successor, a scholar in the city of Kalho in Assyria copied the 12th tablet of the Gilgamesh epic, which deals at the end with death scenarios of various people, and the very last are that someone isn't being properly buried and dies in battle. And I'm sure that this copy of the 12th tablet of the Gilgamesh epic was produced with the fate of Sargon in mind. And in Israel, the reaction was just one very different, of course. In Assyria, it was traumatic. In Israel, in this case, it was sort of good news that this king had died. But it didn't really change the overall trajectory of history, of course, because the Assyrians continued to get back to the Levant and to Israel, and then also to Judah. So in 701, the Assyrian king Sennacherib attacked Jerusalem. He conquered large parts of Judah. He did not actually, and that's important, he did not conquer Jerusalem. And he doesn't claim he did in his own inscriptions. But he imposed a heavy tribute on Hezekiah, the king of Jerusalem at that time, and significantly made his land, the kingdom of Judah, significantly smaller. So here we actually have a case where we can really easily compare the Assyrian report of that campaign against Judah and other places in the Levant with the one in the Bible. And what we find is, on one hand, really quite pronounced parallels. So, for example, one that has been observed ever since these annals were published by Annals of Sennacherib about this event is that Sennacherib claims in his own inscriptions to have taken a tribute of 30 talents of gold from Hezekiah. And that is exactly the same number that's also mentioned in the Bible. So here we would have a case where the Bible turns out to be historically remarkably accurate. But then there is, of course, the fact that the Bible is not history writing. The Bible has a very clear theological agenda. And so the Assyrian assault in the end is presented in the Bible as a great defeat of Assyria. In the end, the Bible claims the angel of the Lord cut down 185,000 Assyrian soldiers, and the Assyrians had to retreat, and Hezekiah is this great heroic king who saves Judah. And that is, of course, not really historically accurate. Probably the Assyrians just didn't come to an end with their assault on Jerusalem because it didn't make sense to invest too many troops and so on. And so they were happy with just having Hezekiah as a vassal king, which he seems to have been ever since then. And so was his son and successor Manasseh. And one famous thing that then might have happened and that had a big impact on biblical theology and especially on the book of Deuteronomy was that it seems that the Assyrians would impose loyalty oaths. The Assyrian kings would impose loyalty oaths on regular occasions, especially when a new king would come into office, both on their own subjects within Assyria and on all the elite members of the elites in the vassal states in the provinces all over the place. And fundamentally, these loyalty oaths are recorded in large tablets, which were displayed in temples. Mm-hmm. And what has been observed ever since the first of these loyalty oath tablets were discovered in the 1950s in the Syrian city of Kalho is that they have interesting parallels with the book of Deuteronomy, especially in the curse section. So these loyalty oaths end with curse sections mentioning the terrible things that will happen when you are not loyal to the Assyrian king. And there's one sequence where they first refer to, I don't remember it exactly, I think Shamash taking away your eyesight, and then Sin giving you ulcers, skin disease, and then eventually Ishtar, the goddess of love, prompting your wife to lie in the lap of another man. And exactly the same curses, but of course without these deities mentioned, because in the Bible everything of course becomes monotheistic, are mentioned in the same sequence also in the curse section of the book of Deuteronomy. And then of course you have the kind of, well, if you wish, loyalty oaths. But what is striking about the book of Deuteronomy, of course, is the fact that the loyalty oaths there are not to the Assyrian king, they are to God. So your loyalty in Deuteronomy is supposed to be given to God. But otherwise, for example, there's a passage about prophets and dream interpreters possibly not being loyal either to the king in the Assyrian version or to God in the biblical version. And it's very similar in both cases. So it looks like that possibly after the Assyrian power had eventually in the second half of the 7th century BCE become less pronounced, that these loyalty oaths, which most likely the Judeans in Jerusalem also had to swear, and tablets would have existed possibly in Aramaic translations, were used by priests and scholars in Jerusalem to create a completely new text, namely the earliest version of Deuteronomy, which was then reprojected to the time of Moses, much earlier times. But there is, in 2 Kings 22, there is a passage where Hilkiah, the high priest of the Judean king Josiah, finds an old book of the law, and then starts to unify the cult. Everything has to be in Jerusalem, and only one God can be worshipped. This is very much in line with Deuteronomy, and it would seem as though, and that has been argued already in the beginning of the 19th century, that what's described here is actually the discovery of Deuteronomy. And what many now believe is that there was no real discovery. It was an attempt of creating a tradition. The book was newly produced at that time, but of course it had to be divinely inspired. Therefore, it was reprojected into the earliest times, and therefore there had to be a story about this book having been found in this later context. So that would be an example of this adaptation of Mesopotamian ideology, in this case royal ideology, but for a very different purpose. And some Hebrew Bible scholars have actually pointed out that, if you wish, this is an act of democratization. It's anti-royal. And it really is. When you read these passages in Deuteronomy, what you find is that, for example, it says that the Israelites can have a king, okay, but if they have a king, then that king cannot have too many horses and too many women. So all those perks that come with kingship, whether it's a harem or whether it's a large army, are essentially said to be bad. So it's really a kind of theological transformation that's going on here. And you can only understand that, actually, when you see the book of Deuteronomy in this very context. So that's one reason why I think, even for those who consider the Hebrew Bible for themselves an authoritative text, will profit actually from looking at these contexts. Because it's more impressive in a way to see it in what happens here. It's really a rather revolutionary event you can observe here, than when you are totally ignorant of this kind of historical context.
And so some of the one of the charges that I often see leveled at the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, not by necessarily specialists, but by people who are doing their own research in their homes with whatever resources they have, is this identification of these similarities, and then the assertion that actually the Bible is essentially plagiarizing earlier texts, earlier traditions from other cultures. And I think, as you've said, the interesting thing that for me definitely makes the Hebrew Bible a much more fascinating work is knowing those connections and not viewing them as simple plagiarism and copying, but as a very creative adaptation and reworking of existing stereotypes, tropes, textual traditions into something that serves a completely new purpose.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I mean, maybe the most prominent example of parallels between, in that case, a Mesopotamian literary text and the Hebrew Bible is the flood story, which I mentioned earlier, and has been observed ever since the 19th century. And it is indeed true that the story that you find about the flood in the Gilgamesh tradition or in the Babylonian Atram-Rasis epic and the flood story in the Bible, that they really show many similarities in detail. The shape of the ark, for example, is a kind of box, even though the measurements are not totally identical. The fact that when eventually the waters recede, that would be for later. You have these birds that Noah in the Bible and Utanapishti or Atram-Rasis in the Babylonian version send out. But there, for example, you see an interesting difference. So In the Bible, the birds are first a raven, who flutters back and forth, and it's not really clear what he does. And then eventually you have 3 times a dove being sent out. And eventually the dove doesn't return. In the Gilgamesh epic, the birds are a dove, a swallow, and eventually a raven. The dove and the swallow return to the boat because the waters aren't yet receded enough, but the raven does not return. So what has probably happened here? It does seem as though, and that is something that Andrew George in his edition of Gilgamesh has pointed out, that the sequence of birds in the Mesopotamian version makes sense. So the dove and the swallow are birds that nest near to human beings. So having them return to Uttanapishti, the flood hero, makes sense in this etiological sense that it explains the behavior of these birds. The raven does not return because he has found dry land somewhere. And ravens or crows would live farther away from human beings. So that seems to be the rationale behind the sequence of the birds in the Gilgamesh epic. In the Bible, that is kind of lost. Mm-hmm. In other instances, however, the differences are very meaningful. So the Mesopotamian flood story, and especially Atrampasis, very much presents the flood as an attempt at population control. The gods are kind of annoyed by this overpopulation and the noise, especially that human beings are making. Noise is a very common recurring phenomenon in Mesopotamian imagination. You just imagine that these are people all living in these on these rivers nearby in big cities, and it certainly reflects the reality of a lot of people being all over the same place. Mm. In the Bible, you have 2 or 3 times actually God ordering Noah in the context of the flood story to be fruitful and multiply, which seems at first glance not really to be makes that much sense in this context. But at the end of the flood story, okay, he needs to make sure that there is again humanity around. But it's very, very pronounced in it being so different from what you find here in the Babylonian tradition. So that I would again say this is kind of a very deliberate rewriting, essentially stating the opposite of what you find in the Mesopotamian tradition. If you think about the way that people in Israel and Judah would live in these hilly places where population density would actually be pretty low, you can see that there isn't really a great desire in talking about it also, mm-hmm. and having population control in the first place. So it's a very deliberate rewriting of the earlier story. I do think that it is clearly an example where the Bible draws on a Mesopotamian text. I think that is really quite clear because the parallels are so specific. But as you say, it's not just a parallel, it's not just plagiarizing, it's really a creative adaptation. Mm-hmm. And that's what you find all over the place.
Mm-hmm. Talking about creative adaptation, you sent me a comparison of the Enuma Elish and the opening of Genesis. We've got about 15 minutes before we go to audience questions. Would you like to have a look at this?
Yeah, I mean, maybe briefly, it's a little bit complicated, but because first lines are always so terribly important, and the first lines of the Hebrew Bible, of course, matter as well. So the first creation account in the Bible, where God creates the world in 7 days, is, of course, one of the most famous stories ever told. And it has been compared from early on to a Babylonian myth, the Babylonian epic of creation, also known as Enuma Elish. The parallels, however, are not quite as pronounced as they are in the case of the flood stories. And so some people have dismissed this and have said, okay, yes, there's water that plays a role and the earth is mentioned, and God is kind of doing it. But that's what you find all over the place in creation accounts from China or wherever you look. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I can't prove that it's not like that, but what I've worked on here is the very first lines, which you see here, and you can look at the translation. And I have highlighted in bold type the parallels. So it does seem as though both texts begin with a temporal clause, even though in the Bible it's not so clear. So in the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth, heavens and earth, both mentioned in the first lines of the Babylonian epic of creation. And then it goes on that, the earth was still a formless void, darkness covering the face of the sea or the deep, tehom. That could be the same thing as Tiamat, that is the sea, from which in the Babylonian text all creation emerges together from her and from her partner 𝒀₆. In the Bible, of course, again, everything is just God, if you wish. But then you have this, and then eventually there is the thing about that the God's spirit or wind from God, ruach, sweeping over the face of the waters. The waters, again, mentioned also in Noah-Elish. What I found rather remarkable is that you have this reference to the spirit of God, if this is what ruach here really means. It's a complicated matter, but I think it's more likely a spirit than just simply a wind. Mm-hmm. And that is very similar to a weird phrase in line 4 of the Babylonian epic, Momo Tiamat. It's not just that the text here talks about this Tiamat, the embodiment of the sea, but he calls her Momo. And Momo, throughout the epic, is embodied, but here it's kind of abstract. It's a creative spirit. It's what makes things start to come into being. So for me, this looks very much like the Ruach Elohim, like the spirit of God. Mm-hmm. And that is, of course, a very specific parallel. So here I would say you could argue if that's correct. And again, I mean, there are people who wouldn't believe that. But if this is really so, then you would have an example where the biblical authors, in this case, the priestly author, who is usually credited with the first creation account in the Bible, really drew quite heavily on a Babylonian epic that was widely circulating. We know that it was very popular, that students would learn these lines by heart. We have lots of school texts from Mesopotamia where these lines are to be found. You can even find them in the Greek tradition, in Eudemus, a student of Aristotle, who also wrote about these very lines and about Tiamat and 𝒀₆ and even Momo. So it's not that unlikely, I would say, that they were very well known. And in that case, of course, there's a greater likelihood that biblical author might have drawn on them.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Just briefly, again, before we go to audience questions, and you talked about this a little earlier also, why do you think, looking at the context of the Hebrew Bible and the other texts that surround it and inform it, why do you think that that's a relevant study today?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I mean, there's a certain fun in finding these things, of course.
Yes.
And I think, I mean, one thing that I believe, and pointed it out when I talked about Deuteronomy, is that you simply cannot understand really what the biblical authors had in mind and why they were really so remarkable unless you know this context. What were they doing here? They were doing something in response to something else. You have to imagine it's really kind of the imperial periphery writing back. There are these small kingdoms of Israel and then later Judah. These people who are then eventually sent to exile, the Judeans, in 597 after the conquest of Jerusalem by the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II. We know they were there. We actually have cuneiform tablets mentioning the last Judean king Jehoiakim and his entourage being in Babylon, in the city of Babylon, in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar, where they would have encountered these texts. I'm sure they must have texts like the Babylonian Epic of Creation, and also, of course, for example, the great architecture of Babylon. So in the primeval history, the first 11 chapters of the Hebrew Bible, you find at the end the famous story of the Tower of Babel. And I'm sure that this is written in response to the experience of Nebuchadnezzar rebuilding that tower. And again, we know that this construction work was really massive and impressive. We have texts from the city of Uruk, according to which work groups from Uruk were sent to Babylon to work there on Nebuchadnezzar's construction sites at night to the light of torches. So there were hundreds and thousands of people working at these sites. The Judeans must have seen that the ideology of Babylon was, of course, well, we are the center, the navel of the world. At that time, actually, they were. It was really the center. And the tower here embodies that. It's this centripetal message, everything kind of migrating towards Babylon. And again, the Bible, it's the opposite. The tower becomes the symbol of a confusion of tongues and of the people being dispersed all over the earth. So it's really a counter story, and you cannot understand the Bible unless you know that. In addition to that, I would also say that any kind of historical approach to religion, of course, is important because, I mean, it is to some extent, I would hope, an antidote to fundamentalism, which is a scourge of our time, wherever you look. Mm-hmm. And so I believe in the Enlightenment project, in which modern scholarship and science, I think, continues to be involved. In that regard, I have certain issues with some attempts by postmodernist philosophers to relativize everything. I do believe that there are certain things we can figure out that are actually correct and not open for discussion even in the humanities. But I would also at the same time say why I see it so from that perspective as an Enlightenment project, as a kind of critical project that puts into question, of course, but I mean, that's nothing new, the historicity of the Bible, which doesn't necessarily mean it puts into question its authority. That's for everyone else to decide. But I would also say that I'm kind of not particularly impressed by these neo-atheist attempts, Richard Dawkins or people like that, to simply say that the Bible is terrible. It's just an awful book full of nonsense, and modern natural sciences show that it's worthless. This, of course, is completely insufficient. The Bible has been enormously powerful. It has for 2,000 years shaped the world, and it has shaped the world for a reason, because it is a very fascinating book, a collection of texts that all in their own right are extremely exciting. And I mean, we could talk about many others where I could show strange and interesting parallels, whether it's the book of Jonah, where I think you find such, or the story of Joseph or whatever. But the book of Job, and I think that's also something I when I teach my class, for example, I make that very clear. This isn't just about proving the Bible wrong. This is the last thing I want to do. This is not the point.
Thank you. I think we will take a brief break here, and then when we come back, we will answer audience questions. So please make sure you get your questions in now. After the break, we will not take any more questions. So if you'd like an expert to answer your questions, then make sure you join us live next time. Check out digitalhammurabi.com/calendar for details of future interviews. And remember to bring your questions. Welcome back. After the briefest of breaks, we have a good selection of audience questions, so we will get onto those and answer as many as we can, but we will be finishing promptly at 1. So C. Conlon says, this is off topic, but given that SOAS has closed its program and the Department of the Ancient Near East, what do you think the future of Assyriology is, and is there a future for it?
Yeah, that's of course really bad news. I agree, and it's particularly devastating considering the significance of SOAS for the field. Andrew George being the leading expert in Babylonian literature right now, so it's kind of really a shame. And it's also a shame because SOAS, of course, is just next to the British Museum, the greatest repository of cuneiform tablets in the world. So, and all those working at SOAS in Assyriology in recent years have used that museum, of course, for their work. So closing Assyriology at an institution located next to the British Museum is really quite bad. I can only hope that I haven't. I mean, I've heard before from Andrew and others that there was a risk of such a thing happening. I didn't know how bad it really was until I got the news. I can only hope that perhaps someone steps in and says, "Okay, this is ridiculous," and donate some money. But yeah, it's bad. I would also say though that while that is bad news, there is also some good news. I mean, there are, especially in Central Europe, in Germany particularly, but also in France to some extent. I mean, there are not only continuing university programs in Assyriology, but there are also a number of really large projects where graduate students in Assyriology can kind of survive for a couple of years before they may get a job as a professor somewhere, which is obviously difficult. It's a risky career. I mean, it goes without saying. But there are now projects on Babylonian literature in Munich, or Assyrian history also in Munich, on the literary text from Ashur in Heidelberg, for example, to name just a few. There's still, of course, a lot of work being done on Mari in Paris, where Dominique Charpin is at the Collège de France in a very prominent, important position. So I wouldn't say the situation is altogether only bad. And it's a mixed story. And I mean, you pointed out that there is actually a lot of interest in what we are doing, and all the more important it is that people like you, Ming, are actually doing the good work of kind of helping us to also convey the excitement of the field to others. I'm sometimes a little bit frustrated about the way the news cycle works. Journalists are very focused on archaeology, and I mean, I'm happy about archaeologists getting a lot of press, but it's sometimes actually when an archaeologist finds a new text in a museum, it's actually much more exciting and actually would make a better story, I think, than when someone else has just found another goat stable somewhere in the Holy Land from 2,000 years ago or so, which is fine, but it's not really earth-shattering. And however, definitely sort of almost automatically gets a lot of news. And I think so it's important that while we continue, of course, our scholarly work, we get perhaps a little more involved also in popularizing our work, which again, I think isn't so hard. I mean, you had here in New Haven the exhibition that you mentioned, Ancient Mesopotamian Speaks exhibition that I curated together with Annette Lassen and Klaus Wagensonner, and that was quite successful. And I mean, there's the attraction also of the tangibility of the object, that people would get to see these little miniature masterworks from Mesopotamia, with cylinder seals or tablets, and realize it's 4,000 years old, and yet gives us a glimpse into that world. So I think there are ways for us to do it, but we have to do it in order to avoid further stories like the one about 𝑒𝑭S.
Definitely. And the tricky thing is that you have to either do it in your own time or persuade an institution that this is work worthwhile popularizing, and persuade them to pay you for doing it, which can be a little on the tricky side, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I can see that, yeah.
So we have a super chat from 123 Gubapi for 20, I think, Australian dollars. Thank you very much. Dr. Fram, what is a question you are currently turning over in your mind? From your study area, what question would you like to find an answer to?
Well, I mean, since we are talking here about the Bible in its ancient Near Eastern setting and its context, maybe I'll talk about something in that area. I mean, I have other things I'm doing that have nothing to do with the Bible, but I just gave a lecture, an electronic lecture at Harvard, on another story from the primeval history, and then the famous story of Cain and Abel, the first murder story in the world. And up to now, this was a story for which no one had really suggested any Mesopotamian parallels. But I think there actually is one. There is a very strange myth known from only one copy, but according to the colophon of that copy, that text was known both in Babylon and in Ashur. So it must have been a little bit more widely circulating. And it's a story about a god by the name of Cain, who with his with this plow creates together with earth a number of additional deities. So there's a succession of gods and goddesses. The gods following this Cain seem mostly to be gods related to animal husbandry, shepherd gods, if you wish. And each generation of gods kills their parents and then marries their mothers and or sisters. This is kind of the situation. The first parallel, and that was something a student of mine actually pointed out to me, Eli Tatwa figured that out, is that the name Cain and the name Cain, of course, are quite similar. Now, in the story, in the Babylonian story, it is actually Cain who is killed and not the killer. But otherwise, I mean, it's still kind of intriguing. And in the Bible, the story of Cain continues with further murder stories, if you wish. There's a story of Lamech, who also kills others. And then the final thing that these stories have in common, again, I think it's these specifics that make parallels compelling. Up to now, I would say, maybe, and Cain could be, not so sure. But what's interesting is that this Chaim is also said in the Babylonian myths to have founded a city. And the Hebrew Bible claims that Cain founded one too, the first city in the world. And according to the biblical text, he named it after the name of his son, Enoch. But my predecessor here at Yale, Bill Heller, has already argued that that might be kind of the result of kind of a mistake in the biblical text, and that actually what the biblical text originally had was that he named it after the name of the son of Enoch. The name of the son of Enoch was Irad. And Irad sounds very much like Eridu, the first city in Mesopotamia and in later Mesopotamian tradition, in fact. So you have these parallels with Cain and Chaim, the names very similar, the murder stories, the generational business of succeeding generations. Of course, in the case of Babylonia, it's a myth. In the case of the Bible, it cannot be a myth because there's only one God. So instead of gods, you have human beings. And then you have the business with the city and the founding of the first city, which might even be a Mesopotamian city. So this is something I haven't written yet about, but I might at some point write about, and that has excited me. And I'm kind of thinking at some point, right now I'm writing a book on Assyria. But after that, I might write something maybe on the primeval history. I feel like it would be interesting. I mean, the primeval history is not a coherent text. This is the first 11 chapters of the Hebrew Bible in Genesis, beginning with creation, ending with the Tower of Babel. And you have different layers, redactional, editorial layers in that part of the Bible like elsewhere. But I would still say, I mean, it is kind of it's the part about Mesopotamia. It's where creation takes place essentially there. The paradise is where the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers are located, and so on and so forth. The story of Adam and Eve have resonances with Mesopotamian myths, and the Cain and Abel story, the story of the flood, as I mentioned, the Tower of Babel, the Table of Nations is very much sort of a 6th century text, it seems to me, when you look at the nations actually mentioned there. It's the geographic horizon. So I would thinking of perhaps writing a book about these connections.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Tim Smith says, thank you, Dr. Fram, in advance. How much resistance was met with putting the book Song of Songs into the Tanakh?
That I am not really well equipped to answer. I mean, for that you would really have to have a specialist in the Hebrew Bible. But I see why the question comes from, namely, of course, why would what is essentially a love song become part of a sacred book? In later interpretation, of course, we would find all these statements that the beloved are metaphors for the church and so on, but that is clearly secondary initially. The Song of Song is fundamentally a love song with lovers interacting with one another, and actually one where, again, you will find Mesopotamian parallels for. So you find similar love songs also in cuneiform with metaphors quite similar. I don't know it that well, but I mean, you have the metaphors about flowers and vegetation and so on, and that's quite Near Eastern, if you wish. I mean, your question, however, of course, brings to mind the fact that the Hebrew Bible is such a wonderful collection because it is so heterogeneous. It is exactly the sort of thing. We have love songs, and we have something like the Book of Ruth, which is very secular, if you wish. Then you have weird stuff like Ezekiel with these really remarkable visions. You have kind of history writing in the books of Kings. So it's this really broad tradition. In this regard, it's, in my view, the most exciting sacred book, if you wish, that we have. I mean, it's far more heterogeneous than the New Testament, and far more heterogeneous, certainly, also than the Quran. There's really nothing like it. And that's one of the reasons why it has resonated and continues to resonate with so many different people. I mean, everyone finds something in that book, in that collection of books, I should say, that is existentially relevant for them.
Wonderful, thank you. We have 123 Goopy again asking, did the Jerusalem elites and priests seek to fill the power vacuum of fading Assyrian influence by putting their god in its place?
Yeah, I mean, I think they may well have, and I do think it's a possibility you could see it in that way. Now, there was a king at the end in the late, I mean, there continued to be a king of Judah, of course, up to the very end of the history of Judah. So it's not that kingship was altogether abolished, but the slow demise of Assyrian power in the Levant during the later reign of Ashurbanipal, who ruled from until 631 BCE, of course, was an opening both for the kings of Judah, who actually tried to enlarge their territory again, eventually to no avail. I mean, it ended up in disaster for them. But it was also an opening for the priesthood to say, okay, I mean, the empire is gone. We have to replace it sort of ideologically with something else. And rather than having this empire in faraway Nineveh, to whom we owe loyalty, our loyalty is all and completely to God. So it's a question of where was monotheism and when was monotheism invented? I would say, of course, this is not just sort of one moment. It's a process. But I think it's a process that may well begin in this moment. I think the imperial idea of one ruler ruling the world, which is the idea of empire fundamentally, is an idea that must have produced thought among priests as to what this means for deities. And so I would say, yes, they may well have thought of at least theoretically, creating a kind of theocracy where God was actually king. And it wasn't really implemented properly politically or so, but as an idea it existed. I mean, later on, when the Hebrew Bible was absorbed by Christianity, these originally democratizing ideas could again be abused. And you can then, of course, go on a crusade with God telling you need to do it, and God is kind of calling you up for it. This was not what these people probably ever had really in mind, because it was politically completely impossible. It always has to take into account these texts like Deuteronomy were written by people who lived in a place that was politically really very weak. But when the texts were absorbed by the world religions of later times, whether it's Christianity or Islam, they were abusable, if you wish.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. We have a couple more questions that I'm not entirely sure if you'll be able to answer them, because I'm not entirely sure what they're asking. So I will read them, and if you don't know, we'll move on to the next one. So Autobot Starscream says, does this comparison from the beginning of the Mesopotamian and Hebrew cosmologies, going back to the screenshot that we looked at earlier, does this comparison debunk young Earth creationism, as it shows terraforming of an existing Earth rather than the creation of Earth out of nothing?
Yeah, I think both the Bible and the Mesopotamian tradition is not a creatio ex nihilo, a creation out of nothing. And that's a question of interpretation. And I think I just saw an announcement of a book that claims that what you find in the Bible is actually creation out of nothing. But to me, that's not really the case. There is something. At the very beginning, as tohu vavohu, and then there's the Spirit of God hovering over the primordial ocean. And as I argued here, I mean, I believe that draws on cosmological ideas that were popular, especially in Babylonia, and that you find expressed in Wayelish, and you've seen it in this example in the text that was on the screen, yeah, where there is sort of a chaotic original. There is matter there at the very beginning. And it's not that nothing is there. So Apsu and Tiamat are already out there. So in this regard, I would say, yeah, I mean, it's not creation out of nothing. I mean, creationism can be debunked for all sorts of reasons. And here, of course, scientists likewise would have good arguments. And what we are dealing with in these texts, of course, these are texts. These are religious attempts to understand the beginning of time. I mean, I've always been fascinated a little bit also by notions of parallels between these cosmological myths from the ancient world and modern cosmological ideas about the Big Bang and so on, where you also have something at the very beginning, very condensed and so on, and where when you see scientists trying to explain what actually happens at the beginning, also seems like almost a mythological approach, and it's very hard for them to explain the very, very beginning of things coming into existence. Mm-hmm. So I think here, of course, we reach a boundary that we will not be able to cross. The question why there is something rather than nothing. I know that some physicists believe they can answer it, but I think that's one of those questions that we are not able to ever answer. And I'm certainly not.
Thank you very much for your answer. We have just briefly, I want to say thank you to Ben Lamoureux and Eli Tadmore, who sent us super chats. We definitely appreciate your support. We appreciate you watching and participating in our conversation today. And that is it for all of our questions. Dr. Fram, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. It was a pleasure for me too. Have a good weekend.
Yeah, you too. And everybody, thank you for joining us. If you're listening after the live recording, please remember you can see a calendar of our live streams on our website if you wish to join us live next time. That's www.digitalhammurabi.com/calendar. And until next time, resist poor scholarship. Always ask, how do you know that? Digital Hammurabi is made possible by generous sponsorship from our patrons. Their support means that we have the technological and academic resources necessary to bring the ancient world directly to you. If you want to join the team, go to patreon.com/digitalhammurabi to see how you can help.